Our speaker this morning needs no introduction for many of you who have attended her classes and workshops over the years here at Plymouth. Dr. Yvette Erasmus, a psychologist, teacher, and consultant, grew up in South Africa during the apartheid, living in the spaces between cultures, on the edges, holding opposites, in her words. She has subsequently lived in Malawi, Germany, and Beverly Hills, and studied cultures and philosophy for years, searching for the common threads that unite us in our humanity. We're especially grateful at this time of challenge and uncertainty that she's here to share her wisdom with us. Yvette, the microphone is yours.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Jackie. That's very lovely. Good morning, everybody. Usually I see a lot of faces on the screen, so I'm used to a lot of nodding and not nodding, and it's going to be a little bit of an adjustment to imagine all of you in my mind as we start this morning. But what I do want to say just as we begin is that I love doing more interactive, discussion-based, Q&A, chat-oriented sessions. And so please feel free to write in the chat, to raise your hands, to interrupt me at any time, and to be as interactive as you may feel like. So if you want me to talk for, the next 50 minutes or so, or 45 minutes or so, I can absolutely do that. And if you interrupt me, it's very welcome. You can, the easiest thing is just to write in the chat. I will be asking quite a few rhetorical questions, but not quite so rhetorical. And I will wait until a few people write in the chat. And then we'll sort of build some content together from there. It's a delight to be with you this morning. I'm used to being in Plymouth on an almost weekly basis on Wednesday mornings. And for the last year, we've moved everything into Zoom, and it's been a bit of a learning curve, I think, for many of us. And so I miss being in the building, and I miss seeing all of people's lovely faces. I'm sure that you have you can relate to what that's been like. And I'm looking forward to some ways that we could be in person again soon. So during times like these, times when things are really unpredictable, one of the questions that my friends and I ask each other very frequently these days is the question of, do you think we'll ever go back to normal? And I've been thinking a lot about that. What does it mean to go back to normal? And do we really want to go back to normal? I know I don't. And it's a time of a lot of questioning of what we're leaving behind, what things are shifting around us, what things are we moving into. And in times like these, I find myself often asking myself a very, very central question of who do I want to be in times like this? Whenever something in my life is not working well or is unpredictable, or I'm being invited to really level up in some pretty significant ways, or I'm really triggered by something, and I find myself reacting in very default, reactive, low consciousness ways, my default tends to be to look at the world outside of me and to wonder how to change it, right? I mean, maybe none of you do this, but I am always putting my energy out into what is wrong with the world, what needs to change in the world, how the people need to change in particular. And my mind wants to do a lot of problem solving out there. And then I look at all of the different things that I could be problem solving: climate change and pollution and human suffering and, health issues and ecological degradation and the incredible amount of diversity that just seems to have no cohesion. And how are we all going to live on this little planet in peace in a sustainable way? And I get very, very overwhelmed and really almost paralyzed and helpless when I begin thinking about what can I do as one little person in the face of all of this, because it feels like the work in front of us some days feels really overwhelming to me. And then when I pull away from the big picture and I just look at my nuclear family and I look at my relationship with my teenager and the fight that I just had with my partner, and I just think, if I can't solve it on a micro level in my own life, how do we stand any hope of changing anything out there? So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit this morning about 5 commitments that I have made in my life that help me ground in times like these. And I'm going to begin by just saying, talking a little bit about what I mean by a commitment, and really invite you this morning to think about your commitments. I'm not here to impose my 5 commitments upon anybody, but I'd like to offer them to you in the spirit of having a bit of a springboard for you to think about which ones resonate with you, which ones don't. Don't ever take anything from anyone that doesn't resonate with your inner being. Always know that your intuition and your gut sense and your felt sense is your best guide for what is right for you. But I will offer my 5. And you can have them. If they resonate with you, just adopt them and you are welcome to them. And then if they help you get more clarity in your own life about what your 5 core commitments are, then it will be time really well spent. So I've been thinking a lot recently about this idea of a commitment. And what is it that we are committed to? What is it that I make a commitment to? And I've been divorced twice. You might say I've got a little bit of a commitment phobia. I don't like joining things. I'm not the person that joins groups or joins communities. I grew up always being a little bit on the outside, and I think that became pretty ingrained in my own psychology. I like to stay on the outside and observe things from a distance for a long time. And then when I commit to things, like I haven't had a lot of success in committing to people because I find people fickle and ever changing and completely unpredictable and reactive. And that does not feel like a very safe place for me to make commitments. And so my 5 commitments are very much about principles and characterological things. They're about the things that I want to develop in my heart. And anytime that the world goes crazy and my relationships go, inside out and squonk and upside down, these are the 5 places that I can ground internally and that give me a sense of meaning and purpose. And so in this sense, I'm defining a commitment as sort of an internal GPS point that you come back to over and over, and that is a theme in your life that gives you a sense of meaning, purpose, groundedness, direction, information. When I get really upset or I find myself avoiding a conflict, which I do a lot these days, unfortunately, I just come right back to what is my promise to myself? What is my deep intention in my life that I am attempting to live into imperfectly? Okay. It's not something that I can always do perfectly, but it's the thing that helps me marshal my energy in a particular direction. So here are my 5 commitments. I'm just going to give you the 5 words, all C's, and then I'm going to flesh them out in a little bit more detail. So the commitments that I'm going to talk about today are consciousness, compassion, choicefulness, courage, and collaborative co-creation. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we develop these, and why we might, and why they're meaningful to me. All right, so my first commitment to myself is one of consciousness. And I'm wondering if people would be willing to write in the chat or speak out loud. When I say the word consciousness, what comes up for you? What are the associations? What does that word mean to you? What does it mean to you to be conscious? And I'm going to wait and just see if anybody would be willing to write. Often people attend webinars and are multitasking, at least I do. So if you're not near a chat place, that's completely fine. Awake, yes. So consciousness is the quality of being awake, of being aware, presence. I like that. Yes, being in the present moment, being conscious of what's happening in that moment. Absolutely. It's the practice of mindfulness. Consciousness is God. Yes. So perhaps being aligned with and in touch with transcendent energies, divine life energies, being attuned to those, being aware and noticing my environment. Absolutely. So the more conscious that I am, the more grounded I am in the present moment, and the more I'm willing to allow the data of the present moment to come into my awareness. And the reason that I think about this as a practice is because I find in my own programming and socialization that I'm very rarely aware of what's actually arising in the present moment. I'm very often much more aware of my interpretations of what's happening in the present moment. And when I realized that I'm more aware of and in touch with my interpretations instead of what is actually arising in raw form in the present moment. I discovered a practice that I would find very, very grounding in letting more data in than seeing the world through the filters that I have. It looks like somebody has a hand up. Yes, Alex, that would be awesome. Let's go ahead and unmute Anne and just find out what Anne is needing or wanting to contribute. Hi, Anne. I think Anne is still muted. And I'm going to wait to see if Alex can help with that. And maybe we'll come back to her. Yeah. All right, so I'm just going to move on. But Anne, if you want to put something in the chat, if there is anything, or, you know, I'm not entirely sure what to do in this moment. I'm going to invite you to just write it in the chat and I'll continue for right now. Okay, so.
Anne, if you can hear me, Anne, if you can unmute yourself, that might help.
Is this me?
There we go.
Something.
Yes, thank you, Jackie. Right. Hi, Anne. Now you're muted again.
I inadvertently hit something. Sorry. I don't have anything to say.
Okay, no problem. It's nice to hear your voice here this morning. So maybe, Alex, you can lower her hand. I'm imagining there may be a way to do that from another end. And now we know. Okay, so let's go back to consciousness for a moment. So consciousness is about the practice of being able to observe what is happening in myself and in the world neutrally. And this is not something that comes naturally to me. I find that I need to practice it because I am usually receiving all of the data that is happening in myself and happening outside of me through a judgmental lens. And what that means is that I have in myself this programming to see everything through the lens of what is right or what is wrong. My dualistic mind will filter the data as it's coming in and is constantly sorting. So as things are happening around me, it's coming through this filter of, do I like it? Do I not like it? Do I think this is good? Do I think this is bad? Do I think this is better? Do I think this is worse? And as that's happening, I'll give you an example. So for example, my daughter walks through the door and she throws her book bag down on the ground and she walks into her bedroom and I'm instantly going, oh, somebody is in a bad mood. And I wonder what just happened. And really, is this, you know, after all of these years of training, is this how we express our emotions and blah, 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 blah. So instantly, my mind is interpreting, is judging, is evaluating, has opinions, has preferences. And as soon as I'm seeing the world through that frame, I'm not actually seeing what's happening in front of me. I'm not attuned, I'm not conscious of all of the data that is available to me in that moment. If I were to slow down all of my judgmental, interpretive, analytical mind chatter, and I were able to just get conscious in the moment, I might notice that I have a sense of tension arising inside of me and a need for some information about what's going on. And I might notice that I find it stressful when my child walks through the house without greeting me, without saying anything. And I might notice that I have a lot of curiosity about what happened and what information I'm missing. And I might also notice that I feel a lot of care for her well-being and that I have a desire to connect with her and to contribute to her well-being. But all of that information gets missed when I'm habitually seeing the world through the lens of what is right and what is wrong, and do I like this and don't I like this, and what needs to be controlled. So this is one of the ways in which this practice of consciousness, of really slowing down and getting into the moment, and then tuning in to what's happening outside of me and what's happening inside of me with a lot more spaciousness and a lot more space, right? Just a lot more slowing down and allowing more information to arise. Because my default information tends to be fear-based, judgmental, and reactive. And when I'm operating in the world from that frame, I'm making lower quality decisions. I have lower quality relationships. I'm somewhat disconnected from my inner being where wisdom resides. And I feel like I'm just putting out fires all the time. So one of my core commitments is this commitment to slowing down and getting more aware before I do any acting. And I'm wondering how that piece is landing on people, what you would add to the practice of mindfulness, what you would, or consciousness. If you have any questions about this practice, if there are any places you get stuck, you are welcome to just put those in the chat. I'd be interested in knowing how other people work with mindfulness. I suppose those really do go together with this practice of consciousness, and if there's anything. And I'm not seeing anything arising in the chat, so I'm just going to keep going for right now. Oh, wait, there is some things in the Q&A. Let me see there. I often see that something is wrong, big or small, but finding the courage to act on that wrong is an ongoing block to feeling effective in the world. Tom, I love that. I have the same thing. And I'm going to talk about courage as well today, because, in fact, why don't I just talk a little bit about courage right now, since you're bringing it up? So for me, the practice of being courageous is the practice of being willing to be uncomfortable, right? Because when I'm being courageous, I'm also afraid. And so when I have a fear coming up, I have an internal block to something. My fear, at least in me, operates like a block. It's an inhibiting emotion in me. And so courage for me lives in my heart. And my heart center, courage also comes from the French word for heart, has to do with what I care about. And for me to develop courage, I've got to be in touch with what I care about. And that's not something that that was cultivated in me as a kiddo, right? I didn't grow up in a family or a culture where what I care about was really privileged in my upbringing. It's something that I've had to walk my way back to as an adult. What mattered to me about me as a child was compliance, obedience, appropriate behavior, good manners, showing up in culturally appropriate ways, fitting the templates, the preferred templates of the adults that I was interacting with. So my experiences as a child had a lot more to do with sort of scanning my environment and then meeting other people's needs. And that kind of a history, at least for myself, got me very out of touch with my own feelings, with my own needs, with my own sense of what I intrinsically cared about. What I cared about mostly was avoiding other people's judgments. And so what that developed in me was a desire to attune to other people's judgments and then mold myself appropriately so that I could avoid judgments. Now, I've grown beyond that, but I just share it because in case any of you have had a similar kind of upbringing, this is going to make it very hard for us to be courageous. Because when our prime directive unconsciously is that we want to avoid other people's judgments, or we want to avoid how other people might feel, then it's going to be very difficult to be courageous. Because if my primary defense strategy for staying safe in the world, and I'm not saying this is you, Tom, at all, I'm just ad-libbing about me right now, right? Obviously, I don't know you at all. So I just want to acknowledge that this is really me. But if all I'm caring about, if my commitment to myself is to make everybody else happy, it's very difficult to be courageous about anything that wants to come from within. So the courage to act on something for me needs to be grounded in a vision that I have of how things could be better, that I'm willing to be uncomfortable for, and that I'm willing to tolerate my fear around. And so this might be a good time for people to just think a little bit about what is it in your own lives that you're currently willing to be uncomfortable for. Where are you willing to get out of a comfort zone and to be uncomfortable, to be unsettled, to do something awkwardly in the service of a higher value? Where does your heart swell up and open up enough that you are willing to do something badly? At least that's what that's the way that I find it helpful to work with courage, is the sense of Marshall Rosenberg, one of my teachers, used to say, anything worth doing is worth doing badly. And that phrase has often helped me with my own perfectionism, where I feel like I don't want to do it because I might say it wrong, or I might hurt someone's feelings, or I might elicit judgment, or I might not do it perfectly. And in those moments when I'm needing courage, I ground myself in the values that I'm willing to kind of feel some shame around, or that I'm willing to look like a fool around, or that I'm willing to have a little bit of humiliation come up if I don't say it exactly right. So I love that statement and that invitation for all of us to be thinking about what we're willing to be courageous about. When we act out of our courage, we expand our worlds. When we act from our fears, when we live controlled by the things we're afraid of, our worlds contract. And they get smaller, and we become more inhibited, and we reduce our capacity a little bit. If you think about how fear lives in your body system, I think somebody, Peg had mentioned something about somatic body practice, which I love. Absolutely helps to slow down, feeling like your feet are on the ground. It's beautiful. Think about how fear lives in your body. Fear goes inward from all directions. It contracts right down into the center of your abdomen. It brings the world in. And courage radiates out. It's got an expansive energy. It helps you expand your world, expand what is possible. Anne wrote, do you think this kind of consciousness is typical of most people? So Anne, I don't know. Here's how I would answer that. And then Tom, I'm coming back to your next question as well. I think that consciousness is a capacity that we develop and a strength that we develop in the same way that if you want to, lift 50-pound weights, you go to the gym and you begin with little weights and you keep, pumping iron until those muscles develop, and our brains work in the same way. The thing that we put our attention on is the thing that actually fires more quickly, right? Our neurology will develop sort of freeways in our mind, and the freeways get bigger and bigger by the amount of times that we go on them. And so if the only thing I'm ever doing in my life is judging and controlling and doing fear-based things, then those are going to be my default actions. Consciousness, the practice of mindfulness, the practice of slowing down, for me anyhow, takes intentionality. I need an intention to do it. And it takes effort. It takes a daily practice of slowing down and noticing. But the more that I do that, the more it becomes internalized as a way of being. And the more that it becomes internalized as a way of being, the more natural it just feels. It takes less and less intention and effort. Just like if you're training for a marathon, in the early days, it feels like you'll never be able to run all of that. And after however many months or years of practice, your body ends up just doing it. You develop a muscle memory. And I think consciousness works very, very much in the same way. So the question of typical, I have no idea. But I do think that we have an innate drive to develop it, to wake up, to begin looking at our defenses, to begin seeing through other people's defenses. We have, in my opinion, an evolutionary life impulse towards more expansion and reaching our potential. And so I think it's a potential that we all have, and I don't think everybody is on that journey. But hopefully we are, right? So Tom's asking, so doing something poorly, like a political argument, is better than being silent. So that really depends on your personal criteria of what is better and worse. So I'm not going to impose my values on you or anyone here, but I would say, let me give you an example. If it's really important for me, if one of my values, and again, I want to really encourage you to figure out your own values. But if one of my values is inclusivity, and for all voices at a table to be heard. And I'm typically in a meeting where 3 people's voices are heard, and I'm noticing that there are voices that are not heard, including perhaps my own. Then I might have the courage, if a value that I have is inclusivity of all voices, then I might want to develop the courage to find ways, new strategies of bringing more voices into that room, even though it is going against a cultural norm. But if one of my values is compliance and obedience and respect for authority, and I see the 3 people who are taking up all the airtime as having that position, then it might not be in alignment with my values to bring other voices in the room. I might have some idea that in this context and in this cultural frame, what we're supposed to do is defer our internal authority to these three people and give them the space. So is that better or worse? For me, depends a lot on relational context. So I don't know. And when it comes to a political argument, I think it's very different when I'm, sitting with my very close friend and we're just getting into all of the ideas and wanting to get into it. And I'm just going to give you all my poorly formed and uneducated opinions, and you're going to give me mine. And together, we're going to examine the limitations of our knowledge, and we're going to challenge one another. And we're going to take a contrary point of view, because the deep value in that conversation is mutual learning and mutual growth and co-creation and thinking together about where our blind spots are. Yeah, I could totally do that poorly. And that relational frame might have a lot of capacity for doing it poorly to be safe. But, there may be other situations where if I'm in the minority and everybody is having a very particular point of view, and I decide that bringing in a counter opinion because it could serve the group's awareness, but I don't have it well formed. Yeah, I may decide, listen, I don't have this whole thing figured out, but here's where I'm at right now. And I want to bring this perspective in because I'm hoping it'll serve group awareness. I think that could definitely be better than being silent. However, if I'm going to bring it in a way that says, listen, you guys are all a bunch of idiots. You don't understand this, and the next thing. And I come in with a lot of attack and criticism. I don't know if that's better than being silent. I don't know if that doesn't just entrench the other side in their opinion and create even more fragmentation and division. So again, I'm going to leave that to a question of like discern in the moment. And there are a lot of concepts to be thinking about. What do we mean by doing it poorly? What do we mean by better? What is the context? What is my deep intention in that moment? And so answers to those questions might give you a richer answer to that really great question. Thank you for bringing that in. Okay, so we've talked about consciousness, getting more aware. And this is also the practice, by the way, of taking multiple perspectives. The more conscious we get, the more able we are to get out of egocentric consciousness, where I'm only aware of me, and I can move into more ethnocentric consciousness, where I can become aware of everybody who is like me. And then I can get into even more expanded ethnocentric consciousness, where I know here's where me and people like me live, and here's where you and people like you live. And I can start taking all of the different perspectives, depending on the frames that people are bringing. That is also a form of consciousness. And then moving out of ethnocentric me versus you, us versus them frames, and into more world-centric consciousness, which has to do with seeing the problems in the world as not being problems between the people, but problems that we as a people can address together. And so we stop turning on one another and we start actually solving problems and issues together, even with diversity, even when there's a lot of diverse opinions and range of ways of doing things. So, and then we can, of course, if you're going with the integral model, move into cosmic consciousness. But I'm going to leave that one alone for this morning because I want to stay, I have a tendency to stay relational and practical. Okay. Once I wake up and I start to become aware of all of the different things that are coming up in me, my next core commitment and one of the next practices for me is the practice of compassion. Because if I start becoming aware of how judgmental and moralistic and fragmented and dualistic and critical I am, and I then greet that with even more self-criticism and self-judgment, it's going to make it very painful for me to continue learning and growing. It's going to make it more likely that all of my internal protective parts and all of my defenses that want to have my back and remind me that I'm a good person, even though I do these, not so great things sometimes, that defensive part of me is going to get more activated if I don't have a self-compassion practice. So I define compassion as having two parts. It is the recognition of human suffering in myself and others, coupled with the desire to alleviate the suffering. And this desire to alleviate the suffering is a key piece to develop and to stay committed to for myself. Because I grew up in systems of punitive justice where we use suffering as a learning tool. I grew up in a family that had a little bit of a consciousness that you deserve to suffer when you've done something bad, because the thinking is that suffering is what's going to teach you to not do it again. We've had, decades of research that show that that kind of punishment and that kind of punitive approach only increases people's shame and defensiveness, and actually leads to increased levels of dysfunction and increased levels of violence in the world. So we know that, but I still have those systems internalized, and the practice of self-compassion is my antidote to the parts of me that want to judge me for being judgmental, or want to judge and criticize all of the things that I find inside of myself that I'm wanting to grow and evolve and develop. So when I find in myself pain, or I find in myself, and by the way, one of the things I learned very quickly was that I convert all of my pain, my felt sense pain, into judgment, because judgment is a way of numbing out from what's distressing on the inside. It's easier for me to be aware of my judgments of how my daughter is behaving than to feel into the fear and the helplessness and the grief that might be underneath the surface. So the practice of compassion for me has also been one of noticing everything. So consciousness, noticing everything that's coming up, and then greeting everything with gentleness, with tenderness, with curiosity, with dignity, and dropping in so that I can get more present and get more gentle with everything that is arising in me. I've internalized a lot of domination systems in my life. And as they arise within me, and judgmental systems, as they arise inside of me, and I greet them with an allowing and an embracing and a gentleness and an understanding that these are all things that I learned and inherited, it becomes a lot easier for me to deal with them and work with them and face them, and get present to them, than when I'm thinking through the lens of, these are all the bad things about me. These are the things I'm supposed to feel shame about. These are the things I'm supposed to exile in me or send into the shadows. So that practice of compassion, of meeting everything that I become aware of with love, is another one of the fundamental commitments that I want to invite you to consider adopting. When we meet everything with love, it becomes transformed. When we meet what is arising with judgment and criticism, we tend to end up in more gridlock. Our relationships get into more gridlock. Political debates just polarize even further. We need a way of being with ourselves and others that is more relational and less divisive. And the practice of self-compassion, the desire to alleviate the suffering that is arising in the moment, instead of my default, which is to fix the suffering or to judge the suffering or to feel satisfied about your suffering because now I'm convinced that you know how it feels, any of those old pieces begin to fall away. So the practice of compassion would be another foundational piece. And for those of you who are familiar with the work that I've been doing at Plymouth, one of the main practices of self-compassion and compassion that for others that I'm always teaching and referring to is the practice of nonviolent communication as a tool for really strengthening this muscle, compassion and consciousness. Any questions on this piece before I move into choicefulness, courage, and collaborative co-creation? I'm just going to slow down for a second and just make sure that there isn't anything that I'm missing. Nope, it looks like everybody is doing well in the Q&A and in the chat. Okay, so then I'm going to move into choicefulness and talk a little bit about how when I'm not conscious of things, when I'm not aware of things, I've internalized programming and I'm living out of my default programming. I'm not really aware of what I'm doing. In those moments, I don't have a lot of freedom and choice in myself or my life because I'm really just playing out what I've absorbed as a child. I haven't questioned it. I haven't developed a witnessing observer self yet who can see and track what I've internalized without identifying with it. But once I develop that consciousness practice and I greet myself and others with self-compassion, I find myself in moments of choicefulness. Choice does not arise until we wake up. Everything that happens before waking up is, you know, a lot of people talk about it as karma or fate, or, you know, it's just the stuff that plays out. It's the reactivity, it's the unexamined life. And I can't get creative with who I want to be. My inner being can't actually emerge in her fullness because there are all of these self-protective defensive strategies that she's developed to sort of keep a buffer between herself and the world. But the moment that I can begin to become more conscious and compassionate, I can begin choosing a new path. I can begin putting some space between the stimulus that's happening out there, and I can start seeing the response that is arising in here. And they're no longer like a puppet on a string, right? I can start snipping all of those cords of the programming and the socialization and the fear that happens up here, where I just am reacting, like I get hijacked by all of these systems inside of me. Once I see them and once I settle into them, I can choose something else. And it's very much like snipping all of those strings and getting to a place of internal freedom. Because in that moment, I'm letting in more data. I'm greeting myself from a different place, which means I'm also greeting you, the proverbial you out there, from a different place. And in those moments, I can begin developing new moves. I can say something that wouldn't be habitual to say. I break my habits, my relational habits, my thinking habits, my perceiving habits. And once I do that, I can get out of child consciousness, and I can get out of victim consciousness, and I can begin to emerge into what I think of as co-creative or collaborative consciousness. And that is my fifth commitment, actually, is the collaborative, co-creative consciousness. And in this consciousness, I don't see myself as a victim of everything that happens to me and just needing to react to everything, because of course I'm going to get angry if you attack me, for example. I no longer, as you are attacking me or criticizing me or offending me or whatever, I can track what's happening inside of me. I can stay conscious of what's happening in me. I can start imagining what might be happening in you. I can greet both of us from a relational container that is filled with a desire to alleviate the suffering of this moment. And I can choose something new. I can choose a new thing to say. I can choose a new response. I can choose to not act out of my defensiveness. I can choose to ground myself in the places where we are the same and ask new questions. I can also choose to come down from any grandiosity that I have and bring myself up from any shame that may be controlling me. And I can stay committed. My fifth commitment about collaborative co-creation is also a commitment to shared humanity. It is one in which I rehumanize myself all the time. I'm not that great, but I'm not that bad. And you also are not that great, and you're not that bad. And what is it like when we join one another in a place of shared humanity, where we're trying to become conscious? We want to work with compassion and care for one another. We start looking for new choices and new possibilities. We're willing to start changing the status quo, examining what we've inherited, and actually becoming grounded in the deep values that are driving us, the deep needs that we have in that moment, and then developing that courage to be uncomfortable, to do the thing that feels unfamiliar, to try the new move, to be willing to not get it right all the time, but to be channeling our attention and our energy in the direction of what it is that we really value. And then working with one another, collaboratively, co-creatively, understanding that I don't have the whole picture and neither do you. But when we begin entering into a new kind of conversation with one another, and we begin getting the worldviews of a lot of different people, and we start putting more things on the table, and we start expressing the beautiful vision that our hearts contain about how things could be better, about how we wish the world was instead of how it always is, and we engage in a new kind of conversation, then we share power with one another. We come from a place of shared humanity, and we work together to begin creating the world that we're longing to inhabit. So this idea of collaborative co-creation is also the practice of not telling other people who they should be, what they should be, how they should think, forcing them through moralistic judgments of should and must and have to, coming with all of our demand energy because we're fear-based in those moments, insisting, forcing, getting violent. We leave that all behind. We leave that all behind and we begin bringing a collaborative consciousness, a partnership consciousness, a co-creative consciousness, an empowered, grounded, conscious, and compassionate way of being into our relationships. And in doing that work, I believe we are fundamentally changing the world. I think that when we begin to live in alignment with a deeper commitment to a new way of being, and we start doing that collectively, and we start helping one another doing that, to do that, that is the thing. It is one of the many things. It's not the only thing, but that is a core part of beginning to create the relationships that you're wanting, the cultures that you're wanting, the communities that you're wanting. But I do believe, at least for myself, this is my area of focus, even though I know there are many ways that we can intervene. But one of them is about really getting clear on what you're here to do, what you are valuing, what you feel internally called to be serving in your own life, and then doing the inner work of showing up in a way that is a deep embodied integrity, where you become the living example of the thing that you are wanting to teach other people how to do. And so that's my invitation to you today, is to think a little bit about the commitments that you would like your life to serve, to ask yourself what it is in your life that you're not willing to be conscious of, and what's getting in the way of that, and how can you support yourself in becoming more aware of the things that you might be avoiding, of creating a compassion practice in your life where you greet yourself and other people with love, with dignity, with gentleness, with a desire to actually contact the pain in every moment, care about the pain that is in the moment, and then move into that moment with a desire to alleviate the pain, not leverage it. We are so conditioned to try and leverage one another's pain. To stay in a place where you remember you have a choice in your response. You may not be able to choose what's happening around you. You may not be able to choose everything that is coming at you, but you always have access to choosing your response, and your response can be different than it's been in the past. Getting your heart muscle, figuring out what it is that you care deeply about, and then being willing to be uncomfortable for that. The development of courage, the development of choosing the more difficult path, the one that's going to really increase your capacity and your strength to stand for things instead of standing against things. Instead of fighting against things, find a way of positioning yourself where you can stand for something. And then your way of being with one another is collaborative and co-creative. Come from a place of shared power and shared humanity. So I'd love to know from you in this moment, questions that are coming up, things that are resonating, which of these commitments you're struggling with the most, where you're at, anything like that, feel free to put it on the chat. But otherwise, this is a good place for us. I think, Jackie, I'm just going to check in with you around timing, where we're at with timing.
Thank you. Yes, we're about at the end of our time. If there are one or two questions in the next 3 or 4 minutes, Yvette, I think would answer them, but otherwise, I think it's probably time to move on.
Fabulous. That sounds lovely. It's been lovely being here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yvette. You've given us lots to think about and lots to work on, and it's a wonderful presentation. Thank you. Next week, Sunday Forum will take a hiatus while we celebrate Easter, but please join us again on Sunday, April 11th, when the Forum, in collaboration with the Climate and Environmental Justice Committee, will host 3 speakers from the Citizens Climate Lobby. You can read more about their proposal to deal with carbon on Plymouth's website under Sunday Forum. And again, thank you, Yvette, so very much. And thank you, Alex Johnson, for your wonderful technical expertise, and have a wonderful day. Thank you all.
Have a wonderful weekend. Bye.
Bye-bye.